What you're about to see is non-corporatized, non-propagandized, independent activist news, and we could use your help to keep it going. Visit patreon.com/actout to become a patron of independent news and act out. This week, the DOJ announced last week that they're breaking up with private prisons. But what does that mean in practice, and is it enough to make a difference? Next up, the Olympics might be over for the crowds and the athletes, but it turns out that the Olympics are a long-lasting force for many, one that is neither inspirational nor cheerful. Let's take a closer look at the latest host city, and the steep prices paid by not only a crippled economy, but an impoverished people. And finally, people talk a lot about just transitions, but do we have any real solutions? Bill Moyer from Backbone Campaign talks about the Solutionary Rail project and how we can use old infrastructure to create new opportunities for both people and planet. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. Before we get into some low-life scum awarding, I want to quickly discuss the announcement from last week that the Department of Justice will be ending their use of private prisons. The news came after a striking report from the Justice Department's Office of the Inspector General found that, in a nutshell, federal prisons run by private prison companies aren't just less safe and less secure than their publicly run counterparts. They're also inadequately supervised by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, which has outsourced the incarceration of 12% of its inmates to 3 giant for-profit prison companies, while allowing gaps in oversight that endangered inmates and put their rights at risk. In the DOJ's announcement of their decision last Thursday, Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates added to that, saying that they simply do not provide the same level of correctional services, programs, and resources, and they do not save substantially on costs. Now, since the announcement, many have been quick to point out that this decision only affects 13 prisons, and by a count from December of last year, about 22,600 inmates, which equals about 12% of the Bureau of Prisons' inmate population. Furthermore, the facilities were meant mainly to house inmates who are mostly low security, criminal alien men with 90 months or less time remaining on their sentences. And furthermore, it will take years for these private institutions to switch over, and no private prison contract will be terminated early, so in all likelihood, this abuse and corruption that we've found in both the Justice Department and the Mother Jones' extensive expose on a CCA prison in Louisiana will continue until these contracts are fully terminated. And finally, furthermore, this decision does not affect state prisons, where most of the U.S.'s inmates are housed, nor does it affect ICE and U.S. Marshal Service detainees, who, in a clusterfuck twist of oversight, are technically in the federal system, but not under the scope of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So, with all of this in mind, does it matter? Do we just say, fuck it, throw up our hands and pretend that this decision means nothing, that it's just not good enough? No. And let me tell you why. First of all, this will actually affect real people's lives. Yes, it's not the whole private prison industrial complex brought to its knees, but it's 22,000 plus lives worth. And that flows into point number 2. Placing things in focus and in context. Does it mean that our prisons will suddenly become beacons of rehabilitation where inmates do yoga and bake cakes like they do in Scandinavia? No, obviously not. Is this an epic leap to equality, justice, and peace? No, but it's a step. If you only ever look at things through the global lens of complete systemic change and ultimate utopia, you're going to have one fuck of a disappointing life. And while it's important that we recognize the amount of work still left for us, and perhaps more importantly the fact that the DOJ is certainly no friend to justice, we have to acknowledge this as a progressive step, an important one. One that can, as the ACLU pointed out, prompt state institutions to follow suit, as they frequently look to their federal counterparts for best practices on prisons. And finally, this matters because we need to recognize when our fights yield positive results. There's no such thing as immediate and complete gratification in our fights for justice. We need to use small victories like this one as fuel and inspiration to keep fighting and to fight harder. This is certainly not the end of our fight. There really is no end to the fight for justice. But this is, again, an important step, one that still holds up when viewed in the greater context of our ongoing battles, and one that deserves a solid fuck yeah from activists across the country. So, fuck yeah. So, the Olympics. Yeah, I know, they're already over, and I certainly won't be the one to cheerily give you a full sports recap because I guess I just don't give a flying fuck if anyone can swim faster than the guy with webbed feet, when in order to build the pool that he's in, tens of thousands of people were violently relocated. Indeed, since 2009, when Rio won the bidding to hold the Games, more than 20,000 families have been evicted from their homes in favelas to make way for arenas and infrastructural projects. And that's just one estimated number. Sports columnist Sally Jenkins reported that 60,000 people have lost their homes to the Rio Games, including residents of Villa Autodromo, possibly the most controversial favela of the Games, as it sits at the edge of Barra de Tijuca, a wealthy suburb, and is slated to be turned into luxury condos after the Games are over. Ultimately, several residents of Autodromo, including those pictured here, refused to be moved, even after intimidation and violence. For example, in one instance, resident Maria de Pena's nose was broken by a city security force as she and some neighbors tried to form a protective cordon in front of her house. Eventually, her home, where she had lived for more than 20 years with her husband, mother, and daughter, was demolished. And she is now one of 20 families living in 20 cottages right outside the gates. A move made unwillingly by the city when they realized that they just couldn't get rid of these last residents. So, might as well house them in small white boxes to try and make it look as natural as possible. But those passing by on their way to this most prestigious of sporting events might not think that a huge sign reading Museum of the Evicted is particularly natural. And for these residents turned activists, that's just the point. To them, the Olympics are nothing more than a destructive force that shoves money in the pockets of few while leaving the many homeless and suffering. A feeble attempt to throw glitter at gross systemic racism, income inequality, and deep-rooted corruption. And while the first Brazilian gold went to a black woman from the City of God favela, this feel-good story is but a passing blip in a sky illuminated by social and political disasters. For example, you may have heard about the suspension of Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff after she was accused of corruption by, as the LA Times pointed out in March, a group of politicians accused of being even more corrupt than she is. In fact, Rousseff is one of only a handful of Brazilian politicians who hasn't ever formally been accused of or investigated for corruption. Meanwhile, 49 out of 81 senators and 303 out of 513 members of the lower house are being investigated for serious crimes of one sort or another. And some sort of another is probably tied to Petrobras. Very long story short, Petrobras is Brazil's national oil company, and as Glenn Greenwald outlined in an interview on Democracy Now! In March, as oil prices increased and as Brazil found huge amounts of oil reserve, it was anticipated that Petrobras would essentially be the engine of Brazil's future economic growth. And it started being drowned, essentially, in profits. They would essentially hire private construction companies to build various platforms and other infrastructure for Petrobras for oil exploration. And they would essentially pay far more than what the contract really called for, and there would then be kickbacks to the head of the construction company, but also to Petrobras and to the politicians who control it, virtually every significant party in Brazil. All that being said, Rusev's impending impeachment outwardly has nothing to do with the oil company, despite the fact that she was the chairman of Petrobras between 2003 and 2010. In fact, the case against Rusev stands on incredibly shifty ground, with clear evidence to suggest that the rich, predominantly white factions of Brazil's cream of the crop orchestrated this shit show in order to get rid of her and the Workers' Party, as they were not able to defeat them at the ballot box. Koch brothers, take note. One of the key figures in this hypocrisy game is Michael Temer, the interim president who garnered a plethora of boos as he opened the Olympic Games earlier this month. And for good reason. Within the first 30 days of office, 3 of his chosen ministers were ousted due to corruption, including one who was caught on tape plotting Dilma's impeachment as a way to shut down the ongoing corruption investigation, as well as indicating that Brazil's military, the media, and the courts were all participants in the impeachment plotting. And that's just the tip of a horrendously corrupt iceberg that dives deep past the battle to take down Rusev, encompassing billions of dollars worth of kickbacks, a severe economic recession, and continued fuckery by the US that dates back to our involvement in the 1964 coup that ousted a left-wing, decidedly non-corrupt government and installed a military dictatorship that disappeared and tortured thousands, Rusev included. And that's not to say that Rusev doesn't have skeletons in her closet. Indeed, she seemed very happy to see the Olympic Games forge ahead, even commenting on her sadness at missing the Games, lamenting, "Imagine that you're going to throw a party. You have worked towards it for several years, creating the conditions, placing the lighting, calling the media, and on the day of the party, someone arrives and takes your place and takes over the party." Yeah, see, I don't think that you should be that quick to be that proud of a party that the majority of your country doesn't think you should be having. That's like living in a house full of roommates telling them that you're having a party, and in the process beating the shit out of one of them, tearing down one of their bedrooms before they have a chance to move their shit out of it, and stealing money from basically every one of them because how else can we afford this goddamn party? Indeed. In June, Rio's governor declared it a financial disaster, which opened the door for a $860 million aid package for, you guessed it, Olympic security. Meanwhile, police officers have been staging protests to decry salary delays and poor working conditions, going so far as to organize a protest at an airport, where officers held up a sign in English reading, "Welcome to Hell." Also, meanwhile, teachers and hospitals are suffering from budget shortfalls as well, prompting protests complete with banners and graffiti reading, "Money only for Olympics, no money for public education," and "Fancy transportation, trashy hospitals, what kind of country is that?" Jessica Azevedo, a Rio resident, had this to say to the New York Times. "The amount that was spent on the Olympics could have helped hospitals that are closing. They should have thought about public health and education first. That's where we are suffering." So, Dilma, I guess the general feeling is, if the only way to throw your party for a few is to ruin the lives of many, skip the fucking party. Brazil doesn't need stadiums that are used for less than a month and then turned into million-dollar piles of shit, like this one in Beijing, or these from Athens, where the Olympic Village had been slated for public housing after the Games, but it kind of never happened. Sorry, bad luck. In fact, bad luck, or just plain assholery, just seems to be the MO of the International Olympic Committee. Earlier this year, more than 58,000 trees were bulldozed in Korea to make room for, wait for it, some fucking ski slopes. That will be in service for a grand total of, wait for it again, 3 fucking days. Side note, this was an old-growth forest with many trees ringing in at over 500 years old, but fuck that, we need to watch people slide downhill on sticks. I mean, why is it that in order to showcase athletic prowess, we have to destroy other humans, animals, and the planet? For all the oohing and eyeing over feats of strength, agility, and speed, I think it would make a fuck ton more sense to ship these magnificent specimens of athleticism out to destroyed favelas and have them earn some medals for building houses, or hell, planting trees in Korea, or cleaning the polluted waters of former Olympic town Beijing. That would not only be worth cheering, it might actually make the Olympics worth having. However, as it stands now, it's just a long festival of despair for many, in the name of a short-lived festival of cash and crowds for the few, the greedy, the low-life scum.
You low-life scum.
So now that we've brought ourselves down with talk of the Olympics, let's bring it back up with talk of just transitions. Just transition basically refers to the idea that we need to transition to sustainable forms of production and do so in a way that secures the livelihoods of workers who find themselves in industries such as fossil fuels or logging. The idea being that green energy isn't only necessary for both people and planet, but can also be a source of economic boom. So that's the idea, but how do we make that actually happen? Well, Bill Moyer from the Backbone campaign may have figured it out, using an already existing but lagging rail infrastructure and infusing it with profit for both people and planet. Take a look.
The idea came out of initially a lot of the work in the Pacific Northwest against turning this region into a fossil fuel corridor to Asia. We realized that Warren Buffett, the benevolent billionaire that people, many people are fans of, is actually the owner of BNSF Railroad. It occurred to us that we should be using that leverage, that mismatch between what Mr. Buffett is, his public persona, and what he's actually doing. So we started working on that, but then we were approached by some railroad workers who said, "Hey, you're not the only ones who have issues with BNSF Railroad and Mr. Buffett." And that was the beginning of a process of learning about rail in general. We learned about railroad workers' conditions and the reality that since the interstate highway system, roadway system in the U.S. was created, it was the freight and passenger traffic fled the rails and moved on to cars and trucks. That created a huge dependence upon railroads on the product that would ship all year long, only on the trains, and that was coal. So that created this long-standing relationship and dependence, really, on the railroad companies and coal. So that was part of it. The second thing that was really a key moment is one of the guys in labor who'd actually been arguing for the coal ports in the Pacific Northwest, sort of on the opposite side of the issues. He said, well, after a long conversation, he said, well, Bill, maybe your team can green this corridor paper that we had done in 2008. I thought that's a pretty cool challenge, to be given a paper that the railroad labor folks did, 8 years ago or whatever, and at that point it was less than that, but they and said, hey, here's a challenge. You're serious about, you environmentalists are serious about this thing and being in solidarity with railroad workers. You really want to do a real alternative. We weren't using the word just transition yet at that point, but that's really what we're talking about. He said, okay, do green this. And so we took that challenge seriously. I think that's a very important opportunity. And I started reaching out to railroad experts around the country.
So, with regard to this idea of the solutionary rail, is this something that people can take into their own communities? Because the rail thing in the U.S., I mean, Europeans oftentimes joke about how horrible the U.S. rail system is, and like you said, it's not really used for passengers that much anymore. Is this something that can then translate from the Pacific Northwest to other communities across the country?
Yeah, and actually, as much as we are focused on the particular Northern Corridor aspect, in all likelihood, this will have to manifest. Not There will have to be a national effort to manifest this. In the once one railroad company and one corridor gets the advantages of electrification, the other railroad companies would want to also share in those benefits. One of the differences between U.S. and other railroad systems is that our right-of-ways, the land and the railroads themselves, are privately owned for the most part. That means that those companies are less apt to make the investment in the infrastructure that's needed, even despite the fact that they could eventually gain from the efficiencies that are inherent in something like rail electrification. We're overcoming these obstacles by proposing that the infrastructure not be privately invested, it not be privately owned, that it be publicly owned, that we have basically over the private right of way, we have a public belt, a public infrastructure that is financed, run, and owned by the public. And in doing that, we also create the potential for having public benefit mandates. So all the electricity that flows into those lines needs to be from renewable sources. For the safety of the community and the welfare of the workers, that there can be no one crew train. There need to be minimum crew sizes for safety and well-being. That the communities need to be served who have not been served because railroads have abandoned all schedules.
So, with regards to the economics of it, and I know that this can get very, very deep into it and wonky, but as simply as you possibly can, explain how you could get somebody like a Warren Buffett, how you could get these private entities to work within this public sphere, and how you can also get politicians who we know are incredibly stingy when it comes to things like renewable energy, how you can get both of these parties to agree on something like the Solutionary Rail.
Yeah. Well, two things. It is in the interest of the railroad companies because right now their business model is failing. There's a bust and boom cycle, and they're in a bust in terms of both coal and crude oils by rail. There are public reasons for that, regulatory and safety reasons for that, and there's just economic reasons for that. Politicians don't do anything unless they are absolutely their survival depends upon it. So we're not treating this as, oh, please BNSF do this, or oh, please politicians do this. We're starting at the grassroots and building up. That's why I'm really excited about this as an alliance building project too, because we've been already building relationships with between environmentalists and labor, railroad labor, but also refinery workers and other workers. The Washington State Labor Council just passed a resolution in support of the Solutionary Rail project. But we really do believe that it has to come from the bottom up, and that's why Solutionary Rail is working to build that coalition with labor, reaching out to agriculture, municipalities, rural communities, tribes, rural electrical co-ops. It's a fascinating part of U.S. history. In the 30s, there were to get electricity to rural America, they created these rural electrical transmission and generation co-ops. So this is a way for us also to be a catalyst for renewable energy development across these rural corridors. Because right now, rural communities can't get the financing they need or possibly the regulatory approval they need to build out new renewable energy generation because they don't have a customer for the electrons at peak production. So when the wind's really blowing, they don't have a place for all those electrons to go. By giving them a customer through all crisscrossing rural America, all of a sudden we have a place for those electrons to go, and we create a much smarter, more stable grid that deals with the problem of variability in renewable energy.
So you talked a little bit about rural America, and this seems to be rural America seems to be where the pipelines are going, and where a lot of companies are looking to fracking and logging and things like that. So do you see this rail idea as that? Could it be a catalyst to putting in jobs into the rail system again, which we haven't seen for 100 or some odd years, and pulling them away from the fossil fuel industry.
Absolutely. That's great. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is it. This is like, people talk about just transition. Like, I hear that all the time, but I rarely see what people are actually talking about. Like, yeah, we should have youth be putting solar panels on buildings. Yeah, that's great. We want that. But we've been talking about that for at least 12 years. And we need to be talking about way bigger scale infrastructure. So Solutionary Rail is definitely a just transition proposal at a very large infrastructural level. It's not a corporate giveaway. It's a way of returning something of value to the commons. It is a way of creating jobs both not just both, in railroad, in renewable energy production, and then in local regional economies. If you're all of a sudden returning service to rural communities who haven't had it for 50 years, all of a sudden family farms, local industry have a way to get their goods and their people to other communities. So it's, I see it very much as a bioregional infrastructure for bioregional economic stimulus and cultural development. Railroads are a fantastic way for people to be together and to travel and be linked up with each other. So I think there's a huge amount of economic potential. And in Washington State, in 1928, we had three times as much rail and 10 times as many people employed in rail. Even then, 15% of it was electrified. So I have full confidence that this isn't Elon Musk. I mean, that's all that stuff's really sexy. This is using existing technology to do what we already know we can do, but just finding a way to have the political will to do it.
For more on the Solutionary Rail project, including write-ups and rundowns that you can use in your community, visit solutionaryrail.org. And to hear more about Bill, Backbone Campaign, and the amazing creative activism that they do, visit backbonecampaign.org. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please do spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. As always, check out the last slide to see all the sites mentioned in this week's show. And be sure to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and subscribe on YouTube. Until next time, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit Patreon.com/actout.